One thing I never did with this engine is getting the rev counter to work. Being a GL model, the factory dash never came with a rev counter or tachometer. It only came with 3 dials. My friend Phil came up with the idea of retrofitting some gauges in the air vents, one of which was a rev counter. And it worked absolutely fine on a standard coil and a set of ignition points. Basically, this type of rev counter works by receiving an impulse spike from the collapsing field in the ignition coil. But this engine's using a wasted spark coil pack. The digital tacho signal comes from the ECU, which just isn't compatible with an analog gauge. So what I'm going to try and do is replicate that impulse spike using a relay, a transistor and a resistor. Okay, so the idea is to just use the coil from inside the relay, which will supply an ignition 12 volt feed to. The other side of that coil will go down to the rev counter or the tachometer. And this will also be connected through the collector of the transistor. The other side of the transistor, the emitter, will go down to earth. The base pin will be connected through a 1K resistor, which should take out any spikes coming from the ECU. Now what should happen, as the ECU spikes its digital pulse to the base pin of the transistor, it will act like a switch and it will make and break the connection, creating a small impulse spike in that coil, which will send to the tack and creating our revs. Okay, let me just try and take this 4-pin relay apart. What we want to do, we only want to keep the coil part of it. We don't actually need the switch. So I'm going to take all this apart. You can't pull that. Let's get some snips. Okay, what I'd like to try and do is get the transistor and the resistor actually soldered into this. So it's just like a little standalone box. And that way I can just connect my live earth, the tachometer and the ECU impulse to the 4 pins. And it just sit nicely behind the dash in its own concealed little box. Okay, I didn't bother filming the soldering, but this is what I've done. You can see I've got my transistor, resistor and relay coil. You're going to have to ignore the pins on the bottom numbering because this is no longer a relay. So what I've done is I have connected pin 86, which is that one, to the live, that will be the ignition live into the coil. Pin 85 will go to the tachometer, which goes to the collector on the transistor here. The base pin is connected through the resistor and that goes to pin 87, which will be connected to the ECU. So the ECU pulse will come into there, and pin 30 is connected to the emitter on the transistor, and that will be earth. So like I say, you're going to have to ignore the numbering on here, because if this was a relay, you'd connect a live onto pin 30, but it's now going to be an earth. If you look at the, if we get another transistor, they're not actually, if that focuses, you can see it doesn't actually say if it's an emitter, a base, or a collector. The way you know is it has a flat surface one side and a curved surface the other side. So if you have it so that the flat surface is facing you, the the first, and you name 1, 2 and 3. The first one is your emitter, the middle pin is your base pin, and the third pin is your collector with the flat side facing, and I used a 2N5551 transistor and a 1000 ohm resistor, and that all fits inside that box. I should be able to just now connect that onto there, and that is all self-contained inside that, and we can now connect our 4 pins on and see what happens. Okay, I've connected the relay, got live in from the ignition, we've got an earth, we've got a wire that comes from the ECU, this is the pulse, and this one goes off to the tachometer. This relay can just sit above the fuse box. Okay, I thought I'd show you quickly what the ECU 5V digital square wave pattern looked like. You can see with the ignition off, I've got no voltage. With the ignition on, constant 5V. As I crank the engine and start it, see you get a square wave. As I increase the RPM, you'll see that the square wave becomes more regular. More patterns. Okay, ignition on and crank.